very happy to continue with our symposium after that first very interesting and inspiring session. Session 2 of our Science, Sanity, and the Semantic Environment 2 symposium has the thematic title of The Power of Words. By the way, my name is Lance Strate, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm the president of the Institute of General Semantics, also professor of communication and media studies at Fordham University in New York. And our first presentation has the very interesting self-reflexive title, The Buried History Within the Buried History. And I'm at a little bit of a loss about the proper pronunciation, but it is Eleni Chatzi.
Yes, that's
Chatzi.
it. That's right. Yes.
And she is a Greek writer. She's published poetry, novels, plays, essays, and translations, and has studied classics at the University of Athens and the University of London. Eleni.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here with you today and to participate in these very interesting discussions. I would like to thank the Institute of General Semantics and Dr. Strate for the invitation. I called my presentation The Buried History Within the Buried History. It is the story of a neglected but great Irish-American radical poet of the beginning of the last century, Lola Ridge. I translated her work, poetry and essays, into Greek in a book titled The Ghetto and Other Poems, which will be published by Ekdosis Kymena, is a Greek publishing house, in the fall of 2022. Ridge's important work has been forgotten in the equally forgotten history of many women artists. Look at their endless letters, those wonderful letters that they scattered among their intimates. Letter writing has always been the medium for artistic expression at the minimum of effort and the minimum of value. The scraps of beauty and philosophy scattered through the great letters of women are like little blocks of marble thrown haphazard, stepping stones for chance crossings, used and kicked aside. Hoarded and built one upon the other, they might have reared stately structures, said Lola Ridge in a lecture in the Midwestern United States in 1919, entitled Women and the Creative Will, referring to women's correspondence. These ephemeral but also great shelters of the artistic expression, thought, and life of women who were lost in time, usually without leaving a trace, are quite reminiscent of the history of Ridge and her work. Lola Ridge, whose real name was Rose Emily Ridge, was an anarchist, modernist, lyric, imagist, radical poet, feminist, and activist. The many descriptive adjectives show the difficulty faced by literary criticism in the reception and evaluation of her work, and the sparse bibliography gives a contradictory picture of the poet's relationship with her time. She was presented by some critics as the most recognized and certainly the most authentic of the poets of the left, and her collection, The Ghetto and Other Poems, 1918, as a work that would go down in history as the work of a genius. For some other scholars, in her own time, Lola Ridge is described, if she ever mentioned, as a minor poet. Nevertheless, Ridge is now considered unfairly neglected, an artist that deserves to be rediscovered along with several other female poets of the left. In recent years, the interest in studying her work and her life has been rekindled. Ridge represents an era of radical transformations in society and art, a passionate search for truth and short life in cheap and cold rented rooms in the tenements of industrial cities. Born in Dublin in 1873, she immigrated with her mother Emma in Hokitika, New Zealand. There she married a goldsmith and lived with him for about 20 years. Leaving him in 1903 and moving with her son Keith to Sydney, Australia, where she studied painting until she finally settled in the United States in 1907. No one knew if she was Irish, New Zealander, Australian, or American. Although she was married, she appeared as single or a widow. Although she had a child, she appeared as child-free. She was visible and invisible at the same time, a self that was constantly redefined and reinvented. Despite her fluid identity and the mystery that veiled her personal life, she had a very dynamic and vibrant presence in the literary and social life of her time, and in the history of the labor and feminist movements. She was closely associated with Emma Goldman's anarchist feminist circle, and her activism in the case of Sacco e Vanzetti, the sentencing to death of two young Italian anarchists for murders they never committed, took on mythical proportions. An active member of the avant-garde literary circle in Greenwich, New York, illustrator and editor-in-chief of major literary magazines of the time, such as Broom and others. She published 5 poetry collections: Dance of Fire, 1935, Firehead, 1930, Red Flag, 1927, The Sun Up and Other Poems, 1920, and her best-known work, The Ghetto and Other Poems, 1918. Although very little of Ridge's work could be described as personal, she was a political advocate of individual freedom. She vigorously, and often at the risk of her life, advocated for the rights of women, workers, blacks, Jews, and other immigrants, homosexuals, and more generally, the right of individuals to oppose conventional standards for the pursuit of sexual fulfillment. In her lecture on female creativity, she argues that sexually constructed gender roles hinder female development. Women are not and have never been biologically inferior to men and incapable of producing art, as everyone believed. From the dawn of human history, woman was a conquered people, placed in the role of the nurturer of the human race, without education and opportunities to shape the world. She limited herself to the little things and used pretending and lying as a weapon of survival. She was thus excluded from the great art that presupposes the truth and sincerity of expression. Even ancient Athens, glittering through time like a sunsplat fountain, presents a strange spectacle of artists and philosophers on one side and stunted, illiterate, cow-like women on the other, she said, 10 years before Virginia Woolf and her well-known essay, A Room of One's Own, 1929. Her poetry, for some critics, belongs to modernism, for others to anarchist or Yiddish modernism, for others to Marxism or realism, or to sentimentalism, and to the Georgian literary school. The inability of literary criticism to classify her writing in a particular literary movement or norm reflects the essence of her work. The Ghetto is an extensive poem, symbolically divided into 9 parts, as a clear reference to female pregnancy, and belongs to the Ghetto and Other Poems collection, along with 44 other poems, published also in 1918. The central theme of the poem, the migrant working woman and the working and craving female body, will form the basis of the proletarian literature that followed in the 1930s. The Ghetto is perhaps Ridge's most important contribution to American literature and reflects this very complex, and if we can call it non-canonical poetic technique that borrows motifs and forms from different literary movements to create a unique narrative poem about the life of Jewish immigrants in Manhattan's Lower East Side. Ridge incorporates for the first time in poetry the experience of immigrants who, with their different religion and language, Yiddish, symbolize otherness in relation to the American middle or working class, and through this diversity explores the issues of immigration, ghettoization, cultural difference, and assimilation. Through Ridge's poetic evocation, Jewish immigrant life becomes a new language, modern, urban, and walled in, as Nancy Burke mentions in her very, very interesting book, Women Poets on the Left. In the ghetto, there is a constant alternation of external and internal poetic landscapes, as well as narrators. From the bustling Hester Street, the market with the merchants' carts and stalls, the anonymous crowd, and the occult worlds of the Jewish tradition, inside the home of a modern family of Jewish immigrants, from the cafe with young anarchists, inside the sweatshops. Then back to the bustling ghetto, the parades, demonstration, and police patrols, prostitutes, and oppressed mothers pushing baby carriages in the park. The people of the ghetto are often an impersonal crowd, impoverished, hungry, a tireless mass in its struggle for survival, and sometimes it is Sadie, Sarah, Anna, or Sodos. We see them clearly as a portrait photo or the characters of a realistic novel. The narrators alternate. The poet speaks not only through her own unique voice in the first person, from her room on the 5th floor of a tenement, but also through the female heroines of the poem. It is an unusual polyphony, according to Bakhtin, which also reveals the complex social material of the poem, the social landscape at the center of which Ridge places the human body. The body in pain, as a mirror of the world, is a condition that characterizes all of Ridge's poetic production. In this sense, the body becomes a political means of expression, and at the same time, the projection of the individual and the personal in the sense of the particularity of the human personality, sexuality, memory, and differentiation. The body is the center of the material and spiritual world and the means of connection with it, especially the injured body, either in the form of physical exhaustion or even erotic ecstasy, or as a reflection of social violence and injustice in the form of beatings, lynching, or the death penalty in her other works. In the poem Electrocution, 1927, from the collection Red Flag, she describes the brutal execution of a death row inmate in the electric chair. Again, all this brutal ritual is expressed by the images of the burning body, the screaming of the flesh, and the white agony of the soul. This man, even in the supreme moment of the loss of life, maintains the consciousness of his uniqueness. He sees his house on the hill and the fields of his homeland being set on fire by lightning. The spectacular body in pain that Ridge portrays in her poems is never presented separately from the person in whom it resides. The painful construction of the political self in her work merges body and mind. Physical chains are also spiritual chains. It is in this relationship between the political and the personal self, political and personal poetry, and even more so when women are in the spotlight, that existing poetic categories collapse. Through the political body, and thus introducing the subjective view of politics, Ridge was differentiated from modernism that was being formed at the time, not through ideas, but through objects, say it, no ideas, but in things, according to the doctrine of William Carlos Williams, but also from the male-centric, conservative, and Protestant modernism of Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, as well as the anti-Semitism of all three. On the other hand, she also differed from the literary tradition of sentimentalists, who wanted women's poetry exclusively lyrical and focused on personal life, communication, and emotional impasses. The use of poetry as a left weapon against social injustice, as happened with Ridge's poem The Stone Face, from her latest collection, The Dance of Fire, 1935, would seem unthinkable and vulgar to the aesthetic elitists of modernism. The poem was accompanied by a photograph of labor martyr Tom Muni in prisoner's uniform on a poster placed on the facades of buildings, on bridges, in trade union halls, and in night schools, in order to raise money for his release. Ridge used poetry to critique the ways in which race, social class, and gender are involved in real events. Ridge verse is free according to the requirements of modernism, often adopting the expansive line of Walt Whitman. At other times, she even uses the traditional and worn-out technique of the sonnet in Shelley's standards, as in the poem Electrocution, or even sentimentalist motifs of abandonment, orphanhood, and death. At the same time, she uses an inaccessible and hermetic language characteristic of the modernists through riddles, puns, ambiguities, and alliterations. The poetry collection, The Sun Up and Other Poems, 1920, differs from Ridge's other works. It is perhaps the only such personal work with a highly experiential character and almost automatic writing deeply affected by the trauma of being systematically abused by her first husband in New Zealand, the emotionally cold relationship with her mother, and the abandonment of her son Kyiv at an orphanage in California as soon as she arrived in America. Children are often present in her poetry. The happy children of the ghetto who wave their flags in the parade, the little boys who tease her in the street, the dead child lying face down on the ground by criminal negligence of his poor parents in the poem The Window on the Fifth Floor, herself as a child in the poem The Sun Up when she talks to Jude, an imaginary protector and friend, or another self that will help her overcome the trauma of her abuse. Ridge clashed with all the normalities of her time, social, gender, and literary, but also with the normality required by the literary criticism of the future. She found herself outside of modernism, despite the great divergences within it, but also outside of the feminist psychoanalytic criticism that prevailed as a school of interpretation for left-wing female poetry later on. Ridge's personal experiences and her own injured body probably prompted her to define the body as a point where individual freedom meets collective freedom, the body as a means of connection and not of separation, racial, gender, class, or ethnic. This need for unity remains relevant today more than ever, in a social present that systematically cultivates the separation between personal and collective freedom, between the individual and the community, between personal fulfillment and solidarity, and destroys this fragile balance, if it ever existed, creating new intolerance and new fanaticism. That was it. Thank you very much. I don't know earlier.
No, thank you. That was wonderful. Perhaps you could put her name in the chat box, so folks will be able to look
Yes.
into her work if they want to. Okay. Wonderful. So our next presentation is entitled The Anthropomorphic Profile of War in the Mass Media. The speaker is a professor of philology at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv in Ukraine. Please welcome Olena Materynska. I get close?
Thank you very much, Lance, for giving me this opportunity to give a small talk today. I'd like to share my presentation with you. Just a moment. Can you see my presentation right now?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much for that. So today we're going to talk about the most painful topic for me. Of course, it's really personal for me, the anthropomorphic profile of war, and it is obvious that I'm going to tackle the problem of the war in Ukraine right now. The presentation of war in Ukraine. The photos you are looking at represent the moment when missiles hit the civil objects in Mykolaiv, one of the cities in Ukraine, and the pictures below were taken during the evacuation from Irpin, the satellite of Kyiv. And you can find many other pictures in the internet. All these facts were depicted in the headlines of the latest news worldwide, and the influence of the media communication on mass consciousness is actively studied within one of the modern linguistic areas, media ecology. This research is a part of the project Ecolinguistic Modes of Discursive Space of Ukraine in the European Multicultural Continuum. And the main publications are represented on the slide. The proposed research aims at outlining primary associations related to the concept war, revealing the impact of mass media on the representation and conceptualization of war in German-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking focus groups, examining the understanding of the main metaphorical and metonymical patterns which create an anthropomorphic image of war. It is essential to understand that within the metaphor, German Gesicht des Krieges, in the English language, the face of war, a generalized image of war as a reflection of human nature is depicted. The speakers of German and Ukrainian demonstrated a good understanding of this expressive stylistic figure. A war acquires human qualities that presuppose a comparison with the human being, and there is a direct hint that only people can start a war. As the Ukrainian-speaking respondents said, this expression is associated primarily with negative aspects. And they wrote, if the war had a face, it would be all scared, gloomy, dirty, empty, angry, and worried. Ukrainian-speaking respondents noted that the expression the face of war is a horrible face of humanity. The first face of war is a picture of Zhenya Geshman, an LA artist, deeply impressed by the face of a wounded Ukrainian teacher, Olena from Chuguyev, a small city in Ukraine, one of the many other first victims of the war in Ukraine. As she mentioned, it was a woman's face which looked like a battlefield, with deep and childish blue eyes. The picture was sold at the auction for $100,000 aimed at helping Ukraine. It was like a thunderstorm for headlines, and this picture flew around the world. Naturally, alongside with the victim, an offender was named, and his face became the personification, the embodiment of the war in Ukraine. The picture of the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, who has started this war and the invasion of Ukraine, were blended with the picture of Hitler, and the creative word games quickly renamed him as Putliak, Putin, Haputin, and so on, reflecting the perception of his role and this apocalyptic tragedy. Another metaphor which flooded the internet was to save Putin's face. It was connected with the fact that despite heavy losses in Ukraine and people's deaths, many politicians and some political forces were still worried about Putin's image and were so afraid that he could lose his face or could be humiliated by the defeated Ukraine. These stylistic figures reflect the current circumstances, which are not just a scary fairy tale, but a horrible reality for Ukraine. The empirical data for this research is extracted mainly from German and Ukrainian papers, but the English-Ukrainian context in different asymmetrical editions are also considered. At the first stage of the study, the anthropomorphic metaphors were derived from the context in German and Ukrainian mass media dated from 2014-2022. The corpus of text of the German Language Institute in Mannheim, in particular CORAP and DIRECO, was used to record the anthropomorphic representation, physiological and psychological profile of war in German. The sociolinguistic experiment and the word association test within the psycholinguistic experiment framework were conducted to verify the data obtained during the analysis of mass media publications in German and Ukrainian. An experiment was conducted using a questionnaire to identify the main associations connected with the notion of war, metaphorical and metonymical cliches and set expressions, and a pilot survey was launched 2021 in Germany at the Ruhr University in Bochum and in Ukraine. Questions were offered to 50 respondents. The empirical data helped to identify the basic conceptual models of the anthropomorphic representation of war in German and Ukrainian mass media, in particular metaphorical ones. So the war is a human being, a living being, has parts of the body, also imaginary, also such as the face of war, is the embodiment of parents, was a father, a mother, a liar, and a destroyer. One of these problems, especially for translation, is that war is masculine in German language, der Krieg, and feminine in the Ukrainian language, Vina. The German folklore entails such images as der Gevatter Tod, Godfather death, and within this pattern, war is described in certain context as a mother in Ukrainian. There is a need for adaptation and descriptive translation of this metaphor. Such an expression in Ukrainian, komu vina, komu Materynska, some experience war, some make profit of it, cannot be directly translated into German or English. The problem evoked by this metaphorical pattern is that it is not always only metaphorical, but can also be the metaphonymical one. For example, in German, pro-westliches versus pro-russisches Gesicht, pro-Western, pro-Russian face of war, and so on and so forth. Not only the personified image of war is created, but also metonymical part-whole relation is reconstructed to mean that certain people represent the image of war. The metaphonymy enriches the context with its double sense implicated by one stylistic figure. The personified image of Ukraine as a woman allows us to perceive the suffering of the generalized female image of mother, wife, sister, daughter as the suffering of the whole country. The anthropocentric worldview in this case emphasizes the dualism of eco-conscious attitude to life, nature, and blatant disregard for all moral values and ideals. And still, there is an obvious tone in gender asymmetry today in Ukraine, as women are viewed upon as warriors, able to defend their own country. Of course, some images are equivalent in the contrasted languages, such as in German, Kinder des Krieges, in the English language, children of war. And war can give birth and bring up its children according to this model. There are more than 950 children who have suffered in this war. 339 were killed. Ukraine calls for giving up the status of children of war to these children, and several petitions have been already registered. They went through hell in Mariupol, drank rainwater from puddles, had nothing to eat, and were hiding from the severe bombings of their native city. The war was cruel to these children and saw no difference in killing them or taking away their childhood and raising them up in raw basements. On the left, you see also the picture of my husband's parents' house in Mariupol, which was totally destroyed, and there is nothing left. Unfortunately, the country is also dealing now with the ecocide. Reconstruction of the country is already facing environmental dangers caused by the invaders in the Chernobyl zone, destruction of dams, pollution of water bodies, the Azov and Black Seas, and environmental disasters in destroyed cities such as Mariupol, Irpin, Bucha, and many others. Nuclear threats. Environmental security is becoming part of public welfare, and ecolinguistic studies make it possible to identify at an interdisciplinary level the points of interaction between activities to maintain environmental balance and harmonize the media environment. There is also a growing awareness of the importance of this aspect of overcoming Russian military aggression in the German-speaking media. In many German language publications and on the websites of environmental organizations, the metaphor climate fight is war has been registered. Journalists emphasize the inevitability of the consequences of the war on ecological systems. Explosions and rockets pollute soil, water, and air and contribute to climate change. All this is very harmful to the environment. The legislation of Ukraine, Article 441 of the Criminal Code of Ukraine, fixes the concept of ecocide, and this is precisely the crime that the invaders are currently committing on the territory of Ukraine. The ecological catastrophe in Ukraine is becoming a real threat to humanity. The ecological discourse is becoming an integral part of the modern German language media content and reports of military actions in Ukraine. Anthropomorphic metaphor is becoming a powerful tool for depicting environmental hazards in Ukraine in media publications. The very notion of war is personified within the metaphorical patterns war, a living being, a human being, and war is a destroyer. The examples are presented on this slide. For example, war in Ukraine causes massive environmental damage, or war endangers. Climate and nature are endowed with human qualities within the modal nature, climate, a living being. For example, the Earth is on the verge of falling into uncontrollable climate chaos. Damage to the ecological system and people is described by the anthropocentric ideas about the nature of the damage, for example, about getting scars on population, biodiversity, and ecosystems. It should be mentioned that the definition of war is vast in its meanings, and it's used in absolutely different ways. In different combination, one can talk about war of religion, war on terror, language wars, and so on and so forth. So it moves very easily from one plane of reference to the other. When asked to define the term war, respondents provided definitions based on their own perceptions. Examples are represented on the slide. For example, war is characterized by destructive interference in all areas of the life of the population. Ukrainian-speaking respondents noted that the war arises from a sense of inferiority, selfishness, and struggle for illusory ideas. There is the definition on the slide, which I like most. It's about rights and about how one should avoid wars. So human dignity is inviolable, or it is looked the other way while human life is at stake. Life will be taken away, although one could consider other possible solutions for everything. An equally important problem that arises during the analysis of media reports in German and Ukrainian mass media is the equivalence of the concepts used to describe events in Ukraine. Military conflict or military confrontation, armed conflict, war, or settlement of the situation or conflict resolution. Playing with such notions is a part of information war and a reason why the reaction to the events in eastern Ukraine in 2014 was postponed. It is also justified to notice that the German-speaking community used the term very carefully, believing it has a global character. We can compare some multimodal examples from different German papers reflecting the slow change in the public opinion about what is going on in Ukraine. Before the war broke out, it was Ukraine conflict, and we can observe such context as the Ukraine conflict with Russia, not the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. And then a bit later, when the war broke out, there was no more doubt to call it war, and not just conflict or situation. Moreover, one can notice even articles with headlines about the Third World War. 2021 respondents were asked, the German respondents were asked to provide an appropriate definition of events in Eastern Ukraine using the above-mentioned concepts or their own definitions. And 40% of German-speaking respondents described the situation in Ukraine as militärische Auseinandersetzung, military conflict or military confrontation, and 36% as the war. 12% chose the variant der Konflikt, conflict. So the majority of the Ukrainian-speaking respondents, correspondingly, they choose, 56 of them choose the variant war, nobody choose the variant conflict. These lexemes denote new strategies and tactics of war. They are called as hybrid war, or information war, information warfare. As we see on this slide, there is a slight difference in understanding this notion also in Ukrainian and in English, and in asymmetrical editions, the translations sometimes avoid these slight nuances, slight shades of meaning. The word association test allowed revealing the respondents' perception of war. They had to describe their attitude to war and their association with this word with key notions. The results are presented on the slide, just one of the examples. So they gave such keywords as violence, destruction, fear, refuge, military, or death, cruelty, inhumanity, brutalization, lies, ideologies. Their reactions lie mainly in the emotional or mental plane, and as you can observe on this scheme, so the concepts such as depression, hopelessness, insecurity, distrust, despair, and traumatization are connected with this notion. Or in the material plane, such as displacement, refugees, internally displaced persons, collateral damage, loss, victims of war, homelessness, poverty, misery, and so on. So the above material allows drawing the following conclusions. The notion of ecological consciousness distinguished within the conceptual paradigm of media ecology described the tendency to raise the moral responsibility in the media environment, even if it is the mere translation of the already existing contents. The semantics of the anthropomorphic metaphors, metaphtonymy, as an interplay of the metaphor and metonymy, makes these stylistic figures a real challenge for translation because of the multi-layer meanings implied. The mass media can draw attention to the inconsistency of what is happening globally, forming the physiological and psychological profile of war within the basic associated anthropomorphic ideas of human being about the surrounding world. The anthropomorphic metaphor, being an instrument of powerful manipulative influence on the readership, comes into the focus of media ecology as an element of the ecolinguistic consciousness. Further research prospects include studying the associative basis for developing an anthropomorphic image of war in the socio-psycholinguistic dimension. And of course, the language sample could be extensively expanded. And I'd like to end this report also with the reactions of the respondents when they were asked how one can just finish all the wars or avoid them. So international integration instead of isolation. One of the answers was, as long as there are people, there will be wars, and we should learn how to prevent them. And tolerance and openness towards newcomers and strangers was considered to be the key to avoiding military conflicts on the earth. And thank you very much for your attention. I hope I was just on time.
Thank you, Olena.
Thank
We
you.
continue now with the next talk, which is entitled The Insanity of the Creative Semantic Environments in Between COVID-19 and Military Conflict in Ukraine. It's a co-authored paper by Olena Marina, who is also the professor of philology at Kyiv National Linguistic University, and Igor Korolyov, who is at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv, Ukraine. And I believe, Olena, you'll be doing the presentation.
Yes, Lance, thank you very much. But Igor,
Thank
first,
you
you're welcome.
Yeah, good morning and good evening to all speakers and participants. Dear Lance, thank you for inviting my colleague Olena Marina and me to participate in the symposium of the Institute of General Semantics. We're happy to share the results of our research on the creative semantic environments. Now let me hand over to Professor Olena Marina.
Okay, thank you, Igor. Thank you, Lance. Just a little technical thing. So can you see my presentation? And
Yes, we can see it.
Yes.
I'll try to make full screen, so if it doesn't work, it's not a problem. Okay, can you see the full screen presentation or no? No, okay.
Full screen, no.
Yeah, so if it's okay with you, I will stay like that, so not to just waste time. Okay. So thank you. Also, thank you, Lance, for inviting us, really. And so this is really, I would say, a big responsibility. It's really honorable to speak in front of such an audience today. So our presentation is the insanity of the creative semantic environments in between COVID-19 and military conflict in Ukraine. And in today's presentation, we are striving to answer a number of questions, of course, in the area of the research that we have conducted and a lot of discussions that we had with Igor for about a month or more about the presentation itself. So, and the first question actually is about what is in the focus of our research and presentation is the creative semantic environments or creative semantic environment. So what is it? What do we proceed from? So, of course, we proceed from the understanding of the semantic environment in general semantics and media ecology. So, the term which was introduced by Wendell Johnson, and we proceed and rely a lot on the explanation of what semantic environments includes by Neil Postman and Lance Strate. So, like Neil Postman says that in one of his works, Crazy Talk, Stupid Talk, he talks about a semantic environment which includes, first of all, people, second, their purposes, third, the general rules of discourse by which such purposes are usually achieved, and fourth, the particular talk actually being used in the situation. And also the definition, the explanation of semantic environment as of media as the semantic environment. So let's just take a look for the semantic environment or creative environment. What people are involved in, on the one hand, creating the semantic environment in its global sense and in perceiving or treating the semantic environment. So as an example, I would provide, of course, this is first, it's the addresser, or it can be a writer, it can be a journalist, so like a person or a collective authorship, so who create this or that message, this or that semantic environment. And in particular today, one of the examples we'll be giving of that of Simon Armitage, a famous poet, and one of his poems, which he responded to the Ukrainian actually conflict, to the war in Ukraine today. So he is one of the people involved in the creative environment, which we have analyzed. Also, we cannot, but we have to take into account the opinion of Luke Harding in this very case, who interviewed Simon Armitage and actually presented so the interview and Armitage, Simon's ideas about the poem, about the war in Ukraine in The Guardian. So then, of course, the audience, right? The target audience of any environment. What feelings, what perceptions do they have in relation to this message which is created? How do they decode? How do they treat this or that message? What feelings does it evoke? Then, of course, the next question goes about creativity of this or that environment. So what kind of semantic environment we can, let's say, label as creative? Is it just about, let's say, art practices? Yeah, so just artists who generate creative environments, like for example, Simon Armitage poetry, or maybe dance, or maybe whatever else. Or the question arises, can we include any other practices in the semantic environment being labeled as creative? The answer to this question that we provide in our presentation and research is that, of course, creative environment is not only the one which is associated with art practices, with artists, musicians, etc. We also include in our research the outcome and the products of such environments as, of course, social media platforms like Instagram, YouTube, and of course, media as it is. So we took into account various assessments of again, I would say assessments related or in accordance with practices, art practices, poetry, which we analyze. And what is important also to mention here is that creative semantic environment or environments about which we are talking today is evolving around the topic of COVID. So some not balance, but some swinging in between COVID-19 and the conflict, the war which is going on in Ukraine. So just to sum up in this question, into the field of creative semantic environments, which include poetic works of poetry, which we analyzed, visual arts, music videos, including dancing and singing and whatever, and media articles as they are. Just one more question to answer is it really a multiplicity of creative semantic environments that we are talking about, or we can talk about one, let's say, global semantic environment which embraces all of the creativity manifestations we are talking about. So proceeding from Neil Postman's idea that all communication is environment and also that media is environment, we would assume that the semantic environment we are talking about, actually we are talking about one. We would use one semantic environment, including different variations. Yeah, so like through poetry, through dance, or through media. And what allows us to do that is also just a theories of adjacent, let's say, disciplines with general semantics and media ecology, multimodality and transmediality, which support our idea of not multitude, probably, of the creative semantic environments we deal with, but singularity of this semantic environment. Because according, for example, to transmediality studies, which in the focus of which is like flow of ideas or spreadability of ideas or dynamics of meaning making across various platforms. Actually, various platforms are united by the manifestations of, let's say, similar ideas, etc. At the same time, also talking about the multimodality, right? So, because of course, and we could see it from the presentations today, semantic environments, the creative semantic environment is constructed multimodally, right? With in combination and integration of various semiotic resources, which are culturally and socially shaped, right? We deal with not just with language, but also with visuals, right? With auditory mode, with of perception, and meaning making, with kinesthetic mode, and many, many others. And just as an example, I would like to present from the artistic environment, actually semantic environment, which we analyzed. So this is on the left on the slide, you can see actually a picture of a famous Ukrainian krump dancer and krump music composer. It's a street dance, a street music. And actually, he's in the shelter, and he created the remix of one of the famous songs by Okean Elzy, one of the famous bands in Ukraine, in about the war which is going on in Ukraine. And just on top, you can see it's a visual representation in black and white, and you can see it's not a shelter anymore, but missiles and everything. So, and now if it works, I hope it works. The remix which he created also is accompanied by a dance, a krump dance of a famous dancer Drone in Ukraine. And you could see the workings of the semantic environment manifested in music, in auditory perception, plus movements, kinesthetics, etc. Could you tell me, does it work? Can you see it? Yes, and here? Yeah, okay.
Now it is time to play. Коли настане день, закінчиться війна, там загубиш себе, побачиш аж до дна.
Okay, so you could get just the idea of that, yes. So, and then another question we've been striving to answer, right? So we understand that we are dealing with creative semantic environments. And another question is about sanity or insanity of the semantic environment. So, and of course, the facets of insanity or sanity of the creative semantic environments we deal with. So, actually, of course, if we analyze simply just the word and its semantics, and of course just different research works on sanity and insanity, we can come up with some of the keywords, right, which are associated with sanity or insanity, like rationality, irrationality, stereotypicality or non-stereotypicality, and many other things. So what is interesting here is how these facets of sanity and insanity, how they characterize, how they are manifested and constructed in the semantic environments under study. So in general, we single out three facets, which are cognitive of sanity and insanity of the creative semantic environments. It is cognitive, semantic, and formal. So, talking about, first of all, cognitive semantic environment, cognitive facet and of insanity or sanity of the semantic environment. First of all, I would like to turn or to get back a little bit to the cognitive, let's say, activities which underlie, right, the process of creation of different poems or music videos or whatever associated with something absurd or impossible or paradoxical or something like that. And talking about this is that according to what we read actually in Alfred Korzybski's work, is that how does the work of a creative personality start? All creative work starts as a feeling, suspicion, intuition, hunch, and it's an unspeakable affective state, and then takes shape of verbal expression. So, and then I would compare it actually with what we could see in The Guardian, where Simon Armitage, so he presents actually what was in his mind and how he created a poem as a response to the war in Ukraine after watching all the news and reading all the papers, etc. So you can see the same. He says that then this great big mass came along, and there was my head was full of images. So that's what Korzybski says about like intuition or feelings which are something unconscious which is in his head first, in the head of a creative person, and then it turns into something rational, rationality, irrationality, language and ideas, etc. So, and this is apart from the interview which I have already talked about from The Guardian, and the interview with Simon Armitage was also accompanied by a number of pictures, and particularly this picture is the picture from Irpin, one of the satellite towns of Kyiv, which was heavily shelled, and this is just the evacuation, one of the scenes from the evacuation from this town. So then this is the piece of poetry itself, actually, and you can see here just a lot of repetitions of it's war again. And Armitage says that when he repeats it's war, actually this repetition stands for not just the war in Ukraine, but a number of other, let's say, wars or military conflicts which have been going on in the world for years. And also what I want to point out here is that one of the words which he talks about, dreams, let bullets be birds, let cluster bombs burst into flocks, right? So it's clear that it's about dreams, it's imaginary, it's metaphor with some paradoxical ground probably. However, here I want to point just to shift attention a little bit from what is going on in the creative personality head in terms of sanity and insanity in creating this creative environment, and to shift to us, to the audience. How does the audience perceive all such messages which are shocking, absurd, stereotypical, probably irrational, etc. And here I would like to turn to cognitive poetics and to Roy Vansur, who says that in general, when we encounter or when we read, when we watch or whatever art, usually our cognitive processes, which are like normal cognitive processes, they are deformed. They become deformed. Then we encounter delayed categorization. It's for moments. It's unconscious or emotional, actually disorientation. This is what happens on the other end, right? In creative environment, in the end of the audience, which I could. I don't know, I could try to dare and make a parallel with what Alfred Korzybskis talks about neurosemantic relaxation. It's just physically when you are okay, when your blood pressure is okay, when you feel nice and everything. But it can be disrupted by sudden emotional tension and the short vessels, improper work or something. And probably just again reading or watching such examples of the creative environment, it's what the audience really feels, or what the audience really perceives from the cognitive point of view. So I know that I will have to finish quickly, and then so just other facets which have already been mentioned: semantic facet and formal facets of sanity and insanity. I could say that actually we have come to a conclusion that in today's creative semantic environment, the meaning making evolves around the topics of which are kind of liminality, something which is in between, something which is ambiguous, something which is uncertain and emotionally disorienting. And so we, like in 2020, the world started with the pandemic, and now the world actually stands together with Ukraine in the military conflict, right? So the words which we, and actually the monkey's face there is about the monkeypox. So this kind of again news which was actually around in the internet for some time as well. So what else? So like keywords, right? And semantically, semantic environment is around the keywords of war and disease, which are liminal in their nature as well. And in general, semantically, I would say that the pandemic and the war, particularly in Ukraine, they can be connected through this metaphor of war. However, when we talk about this metaphor in terms of pandemic, it has been criticized a lot, right? It's really metaphorical conceptualization of the pandemic. However, what we can witness in Ukraine now, it's quite literal. So then also one of the things to add to the box with insanity of the creative environment for today is, of course, various false news and conspiracy theories about both pandemic and the war in Ukraine. So, and to end up, just some other examples of how semantic environments around the world, actually mostly the examples are taken from Ukrainian, again, various platforms, media, social media platforms, etc., and also from American or British media platforms. So how COVID-19 or how Ukrainian war is conceptualized artistically, right? How it is manifested via, let's say, the literary mind of a creative personality. So one of the examples could be Ed Sheeran's kind of performance together with the Ukrainian band Antitila. So, and so you just can see it, I think, in the internet. And I would say that this is a clash, a certain clash of something which of the dance, right, which could have taken place in a peaceful time, right? And then the main character in the video dances also in the ruins of the buildings in Ukraine. Then kind of the faces and other representations, visual and verbal representations, which we encounter about COVID and about war. So you could see there are different collections of poetry, and one of the striking ones, I would say, this image of kind of a lady here, which has a lot of really a lot of interpretations. And then also talking about the war in Ukraine, there are a lot of faces in the war of Ukraine which are presented artistically, again through the literary mind as well. So one of the Ukrainian artists, she presents some different towns and cities of Ukraine in the form of ladies. So, and another, as an example, would be again so the digital artists, and this semantics of liminality, war and disease, right? Disease was previously, now it's war. So she presents it both verbally as well and visually, in other words, multimodally, right? Usually, so it's a real story, what we can see on the picture. It's a real story about a child, right, and about his mother who was shot, unfortunately. And she presents those who are already not, who passed away, who are already not with us, who were shot in the war. They are presented like in fading colors, as if transparent. So, and so actually, that is it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you, Olena and Igor. If you wouldn't mind, thank you. Our final presentation is entitled, of this session, is entitled General Semantics, a Transcendental Metasystem. The speaker is coming to us from Canada by way of Jamaica originally, I believe. And he's a former trustee of the Institute of General Semantics, someone well known to the general semantics community, also a musician, Milton Dawes. Milton, you have to unmute. Unmute, Milton, unmute.
Can you hear me now? Thank you, Lance, and hi, everybody. I over the years, as I continue to study Korzybski's Science and Sanity and apply general semantics principles, I have broadened my understanding and valuing of the system for fun and as a conscious time-binding exercise. As my understanding and appreciation of the system grew, I kept adding to my way of thinking and talking about the system. My latest overview of general semantics is this one. I now think of and value Korzybski general semantics as a transcendental meta-system involving meta-communication, meta-psychology, meta-anthropology, meta-epistemology, meta-ethics, among others. With the time I have, I will share my views on general semantics as meta-epistemology. And if enough time, I expand on the notion of transcendence. In fact, I'll start with the notion of transcendence. Think of transcendence simply in terms of going beyond, a label for a conscious time-binding activity. No metaphysics, no mystery, nothing mystical here. As an activity, transcending as going beyond is not to be interpreted as only leaving behind. The terms transcending, like abstracting, are names of activities. All our activities involve leaving things out and adding things, and going beyond a time-binding activity like other abstractions. We bring our memories, our conceptions and preconceptions, our ideas, or creativity, or beliefs, or values, or knowledge and understanding, or fears and hopes, and so on. Our organism, in their neurological, biological, and psychological activities, are constantly abstracting. We are abstracting when we are breathing. You're abstracting now when you're listening. We're abstracted when we're wondering about things or expecting or digesting and so on. When we're conscious of abstracting, we are aware that in addition to what we're leaving out, we're also bringing things and sometimes seeking to improve. Similar to general semantics, epistemology as theories of the study of the ground of knowledge and understanding can be thought of as practical philosophy. It's a positive feedback process. The more we know and understand about goings on, the more we are able to extend and refine our knowledge and understanding of going on. The higher the probability that there will be a switch in our attitudes and approach. A switch from an intentional, usually elementalistic word-based ways of knowing and understanding things, a switch to an extensional, structural, and operational paradigm. With a more structural, operational, extensional approach, words have less power over us. We go beyond thinking how things are to start seeing how things are interrelated and interactive. The more we notice how things operate, how things behave, the more easily we recognize structural and behavioral similarities. This or those goings on are like those goings on. We make more connections that way. We become more and more world smart. We develop skills in spotting trends and anticipating possibilities. With all this, we can understand ourselves, others, and goings on more and more and lead to higher quality of communication and relationship. In Science and Sanity, Kozik wrote this about the calculus. It is not an exaggeration to say that the calculus is one of the most inspiring, creative, structural methods in mathematics. It is structurally and semantically the logic of sanity. The present work is also to a large extent inspired by it. On page 582 in Sense and Sanity, Korzybski wrote, "It must be emphasized that the main importance of the calculus is in its central idea, namely, the study of a continuous function by following its history by indefinitely small steps." And on page 728, we find this. Science and mathematics show the working of the human mind at its best. Accordingly, we can learn from science and mathematics how this human mind should work to be at its best. Korzybski created the principles of general semantics as mathematizations of the methods and approach of science and mathematics. From the ongoing advancement and successes of science, mathematics, and technology, in furthering our knowledge and understanding of physical, electrical, electromagnetic, biological, and other goings on, it seems reasonable to me to assume that if you're into exploring, knowing, and understanding and theories of epistemology, applying the methods, approach of science and mathematics, especially the method of the calculus, would be an excellent choice. If you remember this, the method of the calculus involves studying continuous functions. Anything we can think of, including the study of knowledge and understanding, can be thought of as continuous functions, changing relationships between ourselves, what we know and understand, and what there might be that could be known and understood. What we know and understand about anything is also knowing and understanding something about a universe of changing relationships. We could describe the universe we know about as a vast collection of continuous functions. We're talking about continuous functions with words we use like comings and goings, ups and downs, and others. Waves, for instance, are excellent examples of continuous function, change in relationships. Anything we think of can be thought of as a wave. So we could think of the universe we know as a vast collection of interrelated and interacting waves producing waves. Knowing about waves can help us understand a lot about goings on in the universe. A general semantics theory of knowing and understanding includes the factor of change in relationship. When we say I know and understand, we are in effect saying there's nothing more to know and understand. If we apply the method of the calculus, we can assume that the quality of abstractions, the results we get from our studies, the judgments we make, the conclusions we arrive at, and the actions we take depend on where we stop our studies. The more steps we take in our studies, the more we refine and expand our knowledge and understanding of goings on, the higher will be the range and quality of our theories. A general semantics transcendental method theory of knowledge and understanding offers this. Words, happenings, goings on, and anything for that matter, can be thought of algebraically as infinite valued semantic variables, continuous functions, changing relationships. Our definitions or descriptions or ideas or beliefs, meanings we give and think things have, like importance and significance and so on. All of this represent the semantic values we give as individuals, and the values we give, the quality of our knowledge and understanding, depends a great deal on the way we use words and the way we let words use us. It's a vicious semantic circle. We use words and words use us. But this is not difficult to navigate if we are conscious of abstracting. If we apply other general semantics principles, we can use our power over words as practice. Instead of saying and thinking, I know, we could say, I know something about. And instead of saying, thinking, I understand, we could say, I understand to some degree. If we talk with the attitude of, I know and I understand, there'll be a natural tendency for us to repress and suppress impulses to know more and understand better. If we think we already know and understand, we are likely to avoid asking questions for fear we will be judged and thought of as stupid. Thinking, saying, I know and I understand, support an attitude of allness and identification. A simple but difficult way to practice non-allness and non-identity is this. Simple but not easy. The next time someone asks you, how are you? Say, I'm okay, as far as I know. Try that. Let's go back to yeah. Okay, let's do this one. This happens. One of the one of the consequences of thinking too much of non-allness or non-identity. But you don't know when to stop. It's difficult to write in something and you realize how much you're leaving out. And that's very difficult. Think of let me talk a little bit about meta. Talk a little bit about transcendental. I talk a little bit about meta. I use meta in the sense of recognizing and selecting common structural, operational, and other features of anything going on. Then integrating and incorporating these invariant features to create an overview, a higher order abstraction. For instance, one could study different accounts of earlier happenings labeled histories, then take a hermeneutic approach and write a historiography, a history of histories, a critical creative overview of histories. In other words, a meta-history. One could study different theories, schools, and practices of psychotherapy and look for common features, then create a meta-psychology. One can create an academy devoted to teaching about teaching. One can do a critical study of diverse media activities as neuro-linguistic and neurosemantic environments, active communication environments embedded in the larger cultural environment. Each of these environments reciprocally infecting and affecting each other. From this ongoing critical creative study of reciprocal media effects on individuals, a society, a culture, a world, we have a media overviewing and communicating about media, leading to a metamedia, media ecology. I want to talk a little bit about yeah. Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, going back to abstracting and leaving out, we usually think of abstracting as having to do with leaving out. But in abstraction, we also bring a great deal. And we forget, usually, that the results we get from our studies and our explorations and whatever we do depends on what we bring to situation. This important non-elementalistic factor is now recognized by quantum scientists in terms of observer-observed interaction, uncertainty principle, complementarity, relativity, fractals, and so on. In general, results we get from our scientific explorations and our everyday interactions and activities depend a great deal on our memories, preconceptions, conceptions, assumptions, theories, beliefs, expectations, and so on that we bring to situation. Right? If you remember this, we had time by then shift from the classical notions of objectivity to a non-elementalistic general semantics operational paradigm, which will involve general uncertainty, probabilities, and etc. If we apply the calculus and are conscious of abstracting, the smallest steps we take in our efforts to know and understand represent the limits of our capabilities to sense, experience, evaluate, know, and understand. They do not represent the limit of what there is to be seen, known, experienced, or understood. Thinking in terms of the principle of non-elementalism, non-knowledge, and non-identity, and studying the history of our explorations, we can recognize that the range and quality of our knowing and understanding, or theories of epistemology, or theories of anything, depend on where we started and when we stopped our studies.
Speaking of which, Milton, I think your time is up. So, I think that's, I think that that's a good place to conclude. And we're running late, but like to spend, at least some time on questions and comments that anyone would like to direct at any of the past four speakers. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. We open up for questions and comments. Carmine, yeah.
Yes, Olena, and I was listening to you, I thought, in terms of the best representation of war, aside from the metaphors of poetry, for me these days is the visual. You had das Gesicht des Krieges, the face of war. You had that woman. I'm tired of words. I guess this is a good place to be tired of words. I write poetry, and in my own poetry, I'm sick to death of metaphors and figurative language. What I'm writing now is almost kind of prose, and I thought that the language and those figures of speech take us away from what's out there, and I thought that woman bandaged and the directly, that says what Ukraine, the war in Ukraine is. I mean, I just think I just add to that. I'm sick to death of figurative language,
Yeah, thank you very much. I can't quite understand you. But my point is that the figurative world, even of news reports, has a really high impact. And the readership, even those people who read this news in Ukraine and abroad, they just make their conclusions of what they are actually reading. Unfortunately, we live in such a world right now when we have also quite a lot of fake news and propaganda, and so it's really hard to differentiate between the reality and between the fake news and factors. So it's for the readers, it's really important how the views are represented. And I've just actually tested on it with my respondents, the German-speaking and the Ukrainian-speaking respondents, and it is obvious that such publications, news reports, articles, which have these figures, stylistic figures, and also the anthropomorphic metaphor, they perceive them more personally, and their reaction is actually, I'd say their reaction is immediate. So they react as they see it, maybe because they are people, they are human beings. And so there is really this contradiction between the human nature and the facts which are presented in this publication about war. That's why I mean the metaphor itself, it's also an instrument nowadays for journalists, for example, to evoke such a personal reaction by the readers. Because, for example, you've told you are tired of words, and I see your point. And in some days, the world will be tired of war in Ukraine, will be tired of this topic. Now we are quite dependent on warfare, which is actually transported to Ukraine because we are struggling every day. And actually, while we are speaking several times, I've heard the air alarm. And I quite understand that perhaps our success is also, depends also on journalists, on media publications, also on creative way to express our opinion and our thoughts about the war in Ukraine. That's why I wouldn't underestimate the anthropomorphic metaphors, from my humble opinion. But I quite understand you as a writer who creates the reality, the creative reality. And perhaps you'll create some other works, arts, or pieces of arts which will impress the world much more than words. Thank you.
Thank you.
Olena, please, yeah. Other Olena, please.
Yeah, thank you, Lance. I would like just to jump in this discussion, if you don't mind. And actually, talking about, Carmine, am I pronouncing your, am I right?
Carmine, yeah.
Carmine, okay, sorry, thank you, yeah. So I would add that I understand what you mean, by being tired of words about war, right, in different perspectives, for example, yes, about something sad or anything. And today we live in the world of visuals mostly. And I would say that visuals, they appeal to our feelings. They evoke empathy and everything immediately. Because visual metaphors, right, or multimodal metaphors, visual and verbal metaphors, at a time. So you just look, that's why you remember it very well. You just looked at this picture, right, and you can see immediately all the horror, all the feelings, and it immediately evokes feelings. It does not really appeal at first seconds, really to your probably intellectual activity, right? But when you hit, let's say, in quotes, when you hit with words without any supplementaries, I mean, without visuals or auditory, this is something which takes a little bit of time, right? So you have to mull it over, right? Probably you have to look for some allusions, for something else. So it does not maybe evoke feelings or empathy as immediately as visuals do, for example. But I would say that in today's world, what would work is really, and what works really, is a combination of these various modes of representation of reality, right? Of any piece fragment of reality, right? War or peace or whatever it is. So it's multimodal representation, words together with visuals, with music, with dance, and anything like that. So just that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to throw in, Carmine, that your comment makes me think of the famous quote from Theodore Adorno: "To write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric."
Yes.
And yet I think also Eleni's talk reminds us of the power of poetry. I'm going to order the Lola Ridge poetry. It's got me interested. Diane, go ahead. You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As I was listening to the speakers who spoke about the Ukraine, it really reminded me of Elie Wiesel, very much so. You're trying to communicate what war is. And to a certain extent, you can't communicate it. So it's hard. You can only communicate, the feeling of fear, of horror, of loss. It's so hard to communicate that fully. In fact, my parents who went through the Holocaust used to say, the people who experienced it can never forget, and the people who didn't experience it can never understand. However, we have to use any communicative ability, whether it be writing, whether it be pictures, whatever, both together, to somehow impress on the world what war is. It is very difficult because I think, unfortunately, we've become apathetic. We're so accustomed to hearing bad things and seeing bad things that we almost don't have empathy for it anymore, sadly. Perhaps that's why any way you try is good. Perhaps it'll work, but it's very, very difficult to communicate the horror of war.
You are quite right. And by this comment, you are showing actually the understanding of what it is. Because the words you use show that your empathy is actually very high. Thanks.
Eleni, please.
I thought what Diane was saying, that it's very difficult to feel, to know what is happening somewhere where the war is happening. And I think apathy is a great problem. And when war becomes a spectacle, then sometimes there's a danger. I think it is necessary because the information should be there, but spectacle creates an emotional coldness and distance from what is happening. So I think there is a thin line there, and when there is much spectacle, there is less emotion sometimes. So I think that that's the dangerous line, where to find this balance. And I think our society is turning more and more, better saying, less and less emotionally involved in what is happening. So that's what I want to note, is the spectacle is a problem, and how it is handled by the media and by the journalists. And I don't know, I'm a writer, so I see things more spiritually and emotionally. And I think it is a grave danger there. How do you cope with emotions, and how this through the media becomes something very okay, and this is happening, and that's it. So I think that's something very important. I mean, the war as a spectacle and what is happening there. Yeah, that's it.
Flora?
Yeah, hi. Hi, everyone. Thank you for these wonderful presentations. I was just thinking regarding war and how we respond. I'm thinking the role that culture plays here, coming from another country, Iran. Persian is my second language, where poetry is absolutely important, and it's something that influenced me as a person. And I've noticed recently when we watch constantly about war, and sometimes not enough, but sometimes way too much, the only comfort I find is finding one of these Persian poets whose work I absolutely adore. And to a point, even when I go to the phone and call a friend who loves poetry as well and say, listen, I've called to share with you this particular poem that was written probably 40, 50 years ago, but it speaks so clearly about this wild and unbearable side of humanity sometimes. So for those of you who write poems, I appreciate that. And the visual aspect, sometimes it's culturally how we interpret from what culture we come from. So I'm wondering if the power of words is as strong as it is in Persian language, for example, in Iran, as it is in Ukraine or other countries. So I was thinking about the role of culture in this. Thank you.
Tom, you want to?
Yeah, I just want to say that I'm so glad that our Ukrainian colleagues can that they're okay and that they can be here with us doing this today and continue to do their work. Thank goodness. And thanks.
Carmine, yeah. You're muted. You're muted, Carmine. Carmine, you're muted.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Yeah. I was just, Mr. Dawes, I was just taken with how your own presentation, you exemplified how much more there is to know about things than we could possibly get to, that it's always a world of et cetera. And I loved all your pauses, those pauses were like, there's so much and you wanted to dip into that. I just love that in your presentation. And the idea of transcendence. I was reading Harry Weinberg about his looking at mystical experiences, that they're not really spiritual or supernatural. What they are is it's reminding me of your speaking about transcendence. Transcendence. That it's when it's like in us the universe has the awareness of itself and as the universe makes its realization of itself, there's like dopamine goes into effect, and when you realize something, you have such these transcendent, mystical experiences. So I just love that you shared that with us.
Thank you. We have only a limited amount of time left, but let's hear from Jodine and Marty in that order. Jodine, or you have your hand raised, but you're not showing up. So let's hear from Marty.
Yeah, I just want to say that I enjoyed all the presentations immensely, and I want to echo Tom's, what he said about our Ukrainian colleagues. Hopefully you're staying well, and Slava Ukraine. I'm so glad you're here. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. And I think that's great sentiment to close this session with Slava Ukraine to Olena and Olena and Igor. And thank you as well to Eleni and to Milton. This has really been an inspiring session, and we look forward to more. As I've said, we are running a little bit late, but we have, we'll eat into our lunch breaks, and so many of you aren't even taking lunch at that time. But, you know, we have, as Bob Dylan said, you have to serve somebody, so we're serving the East Coast, or we're serving New York, because, you know, speaking as a New Yorker, we are the world, you know, that's how we see it. But we'll take about 10-minute break, and we'll start our next session on the half hour. Thank you all.